Hi there, it's Llarold, and Frost DKs have gone through a few sets of changes on the beta that have had an important impact on how they'll play in BFA. While the base skill set is still largely the same, Blizzard's made a few major changes to their offensive cooldowns and talent tree that should have the class feeling a little bit new and different. Let's dive in. Starting with the base class stuff, the base rotational skills Remorseless Winter, Obliterate, Howling Blast, and Frost Strike all work exactly like they have in Legion. Death's Advance is new to all specs of DK, and it's a wimpy, weak, very weak, little mobility skill that's still a pretty decent upgrade from Wraithwalk. Speaking of which, Wraithwalk is now a talent for all specs of DK, and while it's not good, it does mean that DKs will potentially have 2 different mobility keybinds. This is the greatest news ever! Icebound Fortitude has been bumped up from 20% damage reduction to 30%. That's not bad. And finally, Death Grip, Pillar of Frost, and Empower Rune Weapon are all on the GCD. Death Grip's fine, it's still as great as ever, but Pillar of Frost and Empower Rune Weapon have been redesigned a bit, which helps offset them being put on the GCD pretty well. Pillar of Frost is on a shorter cooldown and a shorter duration with a lower base value, but it gets stronger for each rune you spend while it's active. Blizzard had initially toyed around with removing it entirely since it was just a % damage increase with no other mechanics to it, and that seemed boring to them. Players revolted, and Blizzard realized, rightly, that just because it is a boring basic percentage damage increase, it still can change how you play because you'll try to pool resources for when it comes up, so you can drop a bunch of other big hits while your damage cooldown's active. Cooldown Management 101, really. Once Blizzard realized that, they reworked it a bit to lean into that idea. And frankly, it's a better, more interesting cooldown in BFA than it was in Legion, even if it is on the GCD. Empower Rune Weapon has been changed into the Legion talent Hungering Rune Weapon. Because it's on the GCD, the old version where it instantly reset all of your runes and gave you runic power forced you to waste resources, and it was just a real bummer. The BFA version turns it into a haste and resource generation buff for 20 seconds, and it's pretty decent. I'd rather it not be on the GCD, but I think this makes up for it. Now let's look at talents, where there have been some pretty big changes. For the most part, Frost DK talents themselves haven't had massive changes, but they have been rearranged in ways that will really affect talent setups and how the class handles in general. Let's go through the tree tier by tier. In the first row, we have Inexorable Assault, which periodically grants a stacking buff that adds damage to your next Obliterate or Frost Scythe. The synergy with Frost Scythe is interesting and provides a little AoE value in a tier that's otherwise all about single target, but for the most part this talent is pretty boring. Next to it is Icy Talons, which is an attack speed increase that pushes the rotation towards spending runic power at least every 6 seconds in order to maintain the buff. There may be spots where you can't maintain the buff, but the goal would be generally to keep 3 stacks up at all times. This talent is only worth 5% attack speed per stack, down from 12% in Legion, and auto attacks don't really do anything in BFA except deal damage. That all sounds like a big nerf, and like this talent would be terrible. But auto attacks are worth a way higher percentage of your total damage in BFA, and it's very possible, probable even, that this talent winds up being the best option in the row. It's also been changed to work with all of your runic power spenders instead of only Frost Strike, which is a smart move by Blizzard. Cold Heart is just the legendary Cold Heart without the stun. It works like a little DPS cooldown you can line up with your other cooldowns, but otherwise you'll just want to use it whenever you hit 20 stacks. It could be better than Icy Talons depending on the fight, and it is pretty good for leveling and world questing to walk up on a mob and just blast half of its health away, but it's kind of boring. You make a weak aura, you press the button when it's at full stacks, the end. In the next tier, Runic Attenuation has been redesigned from Legion to work on a procs per minute basis. It scales with haste, but not with the attack speed granted by Icy Talons. It's fine, and it works well with Breath of Sindragosa down in the last tier, but it's not anything mind-blowing. Murderous Efficiency is the one talent that hasn't changed or moved from Legion that's actually really good. It has synergy with Obliteration down in the last tier, and you'll probably use it most of the time in BFA, unless Breath of Sindragosa winds up coming back into popularity. Horn of Winter is the same for the most part, but it generates only 20 runic power down from 25. It's not good, it wasn't good in Legion, that's it. Next tier. Death's Reach is great for leveling and world questing, Asphyxiate is a great single target stun for group content, and Blinding Sleet is an AoE disorient. Neato. In the 4th tier, Avalanche is a simple damage proc added onto Rhyme procs. There are reports that the range on Avalanche is a couple yards shorter than Howling Blast's radius, which means you could Howling Blast a pack of enemies and not hit all of them with Avalanche. That's not great. Frozen Pulse now requires less than 3 full runes to activate. In Legion it was only less than 2 full runes. This is a big buff, and pretty much means Frozen Pulse will be up about 90% of the time if you're playing correctly. That's real strong. Frost Scythe is the final talent in the tier, and it's a great talent for long-term AoE damage. It's probably going to wind up worth using in Mythic Dungeons and on ad fights and raids, and Frozen Pulse will be the go-to option for single-target encounters. Tier 5 is another utility tier. You can get a useful but boring trickle of self-shielding from Permafrost, a horrible but still really useful mobility skill in Wraithwalk, or a big self-heal cooldown with an ugly drawback in Death Pact. I would go Wraithwalk most of the time, but Death Pact's alright if you really need a defensive tool. In the next tier, Gathering Storm is similar to how it works in Legion, but it only increases the damage of Remorseless Winter by 10% per rune, and despite what this tooltip says, it's only worth half a second of extra duration per rune. Remorseless Winter is worth proportionally less damage in BFA than it has been in Legion, like quite a bit less, so this talent has lost some steam. Glacial Advance has gotten a major redesign from Legion, and it's looking like a new superstar talent in the tier. It's now a runic power spender on a short cooldown that deals a lot of AoE damage in a straight line in front of you, and applies Razor Ice to every enemy it hits. It's really good, and you generally want to use it on cooldown, but having 2 runic power spenders can be a bit awkward. One more positive note is that its cooldown does scale with haste. So if you're using Icy Talons up in the 1st tier and Glacial Advance on cooldown, you're going to have no problem keeping Icy Talons up at full stacks all the time. Last in the tier is Frostworm's Fury, which is Sindragosa's Fury from the artifact weapon on a 3-minute cooldown. If you use it, you'll want to cast it on the very last second of Pillar of Frost in order to get the maximum bonus. It's not really a great talent, but it is a huge burst ability you can line up with all of your other damage increases to really hit the top of the meters and then spend the next 3 minutes slowly losing ground. Overall, the tuning on it will determine whether it's worth using in single target raid fights, but in an extended AoE it doesn't really seem like it's going to stand a chance next to Glacial Advance. And here we have the final tier. Ice Cap and Obliteration both affect Pillar of Frost. Ice Cap brings it up more often, and Obliteration makes it way stronger while it's up. At this point, Obliteration seems like the much better of the two options. Obliteration has been redesigned from Legion. Now that it's tied to Pillar of Frost, it's a better cooldown with a longer duration and a shorter cooldown. And it's not a separate DPS cooldown that's also on the GCD, so that's just good too. It still has really good synergy with Murderous Efficiency up in Tier 2, and it works pretty well with Frost Scythe as well. Finally, Breath of Sindragosa is still around, and it looks like it might become a legitimate option again. It works pretty much just like it has in previous expansions, so it's basically just a game of pooling up resources and using cooldowns, then riding the wave until you run out of runic power. Some people love it, some people the opposite of that. Me, I think it's fine. It's definitely not great in AoE, so if it does wind up getting used, it'll be for single target or 2 target situations only. Here are the 2 potential talent setups I see being the most popular in BFA. The Frost Scythe Glacial Advance Obliteration setup can do some serious AoE damage, and the Breath of Sindragosa Frozen Pulse setup seems like it would be better for single target. For the Breath of Sindragosa build, you could use Gathering Storm instead of Frostworm's Fury if you wanted to have more sustained DPS, but certainly Glacial Advance and Breath of Sindragosa clash with each other pretty hard. Alright, on to Azerite traits. Decimate is the first trait. It synergizes pretty well with both of Frost's basic procs by increasing your Obliterate crit damage and increasing your Rhyme proc chance. It's simple, but it's good. The one drawback is that it doesn't synergize with Frost Scythe at all. Echoing Howl is almost exactly like the talent Avalanche. It makes Rhyme procs deal extra damage, the end. Maybe it's good, maybe it's bad, but it's definitely not interesting. Frozen Tempest is a pretty modest increase to Remorseless Winter's damage that makes it grant Rhyme when used in AoE. It's the kind of trait you'd only want 1 point in at best, but more than likely you're just going to want 0. Glacial Contagion is a passive, single target DPS increase. Just like Echoing Hal, it could be good, it's probably bad, but either way, it won't change how you play. Icy Citadel is a pretty awesome DPS buff that tacks a bonus onto the end of Pillar of Frost and synergizes extremely well with all the extra killing machine procs granted by Obliteration. This seems like a real go-to trait. Killer Frost is a trait, much like Decimate, that adds a nice bonus onto a base skill and increases killing machine proc rate. Unfortunately, it doesn't synergize with Glacial Advance, which could wind up being a pretty big drawback. Latent Chill works like a mix of Killer Frost and Frozen Pulse. I don't want to be a negative Nelly, but I just don't understand this trait. It's the same as Killer Frost, but harder to use and worse. It's all that and less. So now for the most important questions. Is Frost DK still fun and is it still good? I still like Frost DK, but it feels like it has lost a step compared to Fury Warrior and even Windwalker Monk. Losing the artifact weapon took away passive traits for the most part, which means that in terms of keybinds and bar setup, the base class still feels about the same. That's good because Frost DK in Legion has been a lot of fun. Unfortunately, some of those passive traits from Legion were buffs to resource generation and runic empowerment proc chance. And as a result, Frost feels a lot slower when you're undergeared in BFA than it did in Legion. I'm sorry to not be the bearer of awesome news, but yeah, playing slower just kind of feels disappointing. That being said, there are a lot of new interesting talent setups that I'm excited to play with and learn in BFA, and I really like the new versions of Glacial Advance and Obliteration. Overall, I still think there's a great class that's just a few tweaks from Blizzard away from bursting out and being awesome. Over and over in the history of WoW, there have been specs that feel slow and a little frustrating when you're undergeared, but then you reach a tipping point and they become amazing. The silver lining here with Frost DK is that I think they may be that spec in BFA. Also, 2 mobility buttons, right? Gotta get hyped for kinda, sorta walking fast. Well, I think that about covers it. If you have any questions about Frost DK, ask away. I will be covering other beta updates and putting together more videos soon, so stay tuned for more great BFA beta content, and as always, please like and subscribe. Thanks for watching. Bye.